Welcome to another episode of Facts. Today we have a special episode, and I have special guests with me to talk about the Hampton Court Conference and the making of the King James Version. This is an important issue on many levels. Number one, it's important because it is history, and most that would hold to any kind of form of the King James may not know the history of what produced the King James to begin with, but that there was so much more taking place behind the scenes that created the avenue to open the door for a revision, a new work to be done in England. And I brought on two of what I would be considered good friends, as well as guys that I respect in the subject of the field. I'm going to bring in Timothy Berg as well as Josh Barzon here. Guys, it's good to see you. Thank you for joining the show here on Facts. I know both of you probably have been on before or have followed, at least in the background, discussions that I do or shows that we do. And Tyler and I both just finished a landmark hitting thing, no pun intended. We just hit a landmark in our work here on Facts to destroy the idea that Baptists actually came all the way back in the day, which led us to the early 1600s right here at the Hampton Court. And we purposely didn't touch the Hampton Court, only mentioned it because we intended to bring guests like yourself on to have that discussion. So, Timothy, tell us a little bit about us. Give us about a 30-second rundown. Then, Josh, you jump right in, give a 30-second breakdown of yourself.
Yeah. So Timothy Berg was raised in the Independent Fundamental Baptist movement, my whole life until I was about 30 or so. Went to Bible college here in Oklahoma City. Actually moved from Kansas to come to Heartland Baptist Bible College. Did their 4-year, air quotes, bachelor's degree because they're not an accredited school, but did their full bachelor's diploma, graduated with honors there, and then started into their graduate program and actually did their entire grad program, wrote my thesis and had my thesis accepted in their master's program. So I had a fairly well-rounded fundamentalist education. Did not walk across the stage. I still had, I think, one class or maybe two classes that I needed to do or redo. I think I had failed one of them. And my thesis needed to be tweaked in some minor ways. Didn't do that because right about that time, the Lord brought me out of fundamentalism into what I think is a healthier view of Christian theology and of doctrine and of the gospel. So I've been serving for about 10 years in other settings, primarily at Bridgeway Church. Just finished my master's degree at Southern Seminary and started into my PhD at the same school.
Excellent. Josh?
Awesome. Yeah, so Josh Barzon, and similar to Tim as well, grew up in a fundamentalist background from my teenagehood on. Before that, was actually kind of raised in more of a charismatic leaning, kind of word of faith leaning background. So my life is in kind of theological thirds at this point of kind of word of faith and then independent fundamental Baptist, and now kind of a more balanced form of Christianity. And I went to Fairhaven Baptist College, graduated as well with their version of, bachelor's of theology, and worked as a assistant, wearing a lot of hats at a church after that. And then when I started to work on my doctrinal statement back in 2020 and 21, not too long ago, I really had to do a deep examination of some beliefs that I held to make sure I could present those in my doctrinal statement as believing them for myself. And that's when I came into conflict with a lot of issues with ecclesiology and then especially in bibliology. And from that, the Lord brought many situations in my life to bring me out of King James onlyism, in which I used to be a heavy advocate. And then from that, I wrote this book here, The Forgotten Preface, which uses the preface to the King James translation to show that they would not have held a King James only position if they lived today. So that's kind of who I am and kind of my big work that I've worked on.
Yeah, and we're going to actually at some point jump into the discussion of should printing today of the King James include the preface, because unfortunately most do not. But let's jump right into kind of the Hampton Court and why this meeting was called for. As Tyler and I discussed going through the Trail of Blood, there was a lot of schisms happening in England at this point. Some wanted to maintain their connection in the most peaceable way to the Church of England. Some were hopeful that King James himself, coming over from Scotland, would bring some sort of unity because he didn't want to come into a mess.
Right.
King James was not interested in getting into England and creating a problem, but he also wanted to end schism. He wanted to bring people together. And so what we have at the very beginning is a proposition pretty much given by many of the Puritan ministers in April of 1603, which is called the Millenary Petition. And Timothy, I want to start with you. Kind of break down the Millenary Petition, what it is. I know that there's some myth out there. There was 1,000 signatures, which is very unlikely and things like that. But what was so special about this petition, and how did King James receive it?
Yeah, good question. So to really understand the Millenary Petition and what it's after, you have to step back a little bit in time to what we call the Elizabethan settlement of religion. So before James took the throne, of course, everyone's familiar with the Tudors, the romanticized Tudors, and King Henry VIII's murdering, a number of his wives and then his 3 children that take the throne. Well, he, joins the Reformation for slightly different reasons than Martin Luther's reasons. They're, at least initially, political and personal reasons, and the theological issues kind of lag behind a little bit. And then his 3 children take England on basically a roller coaster ride, because Edward is staunchly Protestant. And so the Reformation takes off just at breakneck speed. But then he dies as a small boy, and his Roman Catholic sister, Mary, takes the throne. So now England goes in a starkly Roman Catholic direction, at breakneck speed. And then she dies fairly early as well. And her sister Elizabeth takes the throne. And Elizabeth is wise enough to understand that England is fighting a battle for its identity, and that there's a huge segment of Roman Catholics who love the traditional religion, of Protestants who are still attached to the shape of traditional religion, the liturgy, the reciting of the creeds, the massive chorals, the cathedrals, bishops, episcopacy. But then there's also that wing that is, they were Edwardian, and they wanted the Reformation to go further and further and basically make England look like Geneva, which we usually just call them Puritans today, or nonconformist. So all of those elements were there, and Elizabeth recognized wisely that she should take what she called a via media, a middle position between some of the more extreme wings. And so she built this peaceable settlement where the Church of England in her time, shaped by the 4 formularies of the Anglican Church, would be reformed in its theology, but still Catholic in its ceremony, in terms of just how the church service was structured. And that worked. She lived and reigned a very, very long time, and peace was held at bay. So when James came to the throne in 1603, what was it, the 25th, March 25th, I think, you can actually go back and read his acceptance speech. And there was a song that Thomas Tomkins created just for his coronation. And you can go listen to it today. It's been sung again at Westminster Abbey, which is really cool. You can hear the actual song that was played as he was crowned. Well, when he took the crown, as he was coming to England from Scotland, of course, he's been a Scottish king since the time he was 1 year old, knew nothing but the life of a king. All those segments in England that had kind of just built peace with each other, their hopes got revived. And they went, oh, maybe this is our chance. Yep. Maybe James will join our side, and we can finally make England the way we want it to be. So Catholics were approaching him, making deals with him and saying, hey, you're going to be Catholic friendly, right? You're going to give us Catholic emancipation. And he was making deals with them. James was behind, under the table, you might say, promising the Roman Catholics all kinds of things. And the same happened with the conformist and the nonconformist. They were making deals with James and essentially hoping he was on their side. Well, that happens with the Puritans as well. And they're hoping, hey, James is coming from Presbyterian Scotland, so surely he'll be Presbyterian like us and open to furthering the Reformation, or in their opinions, they would have said finishing the Reformation. They thought England was, to quote, but halfway reformed. So they approached James, a group of ministers, with what has been called, mistakenly, the Millenary Petition. We don't have the original draft of it, but we do have a very early printing of it, and I've personally seen several of the handwritten copies of it that were made around the same time. And in that petition, they brought a list of grievances to the king and said, hey, here's the things that are wrong with the church. And they were the typical types of Puritan complaints about subscription, to the Book of Common Prayer and its shape. They loved the 39 articles, but the Book of Common Prayer they felt was just too high and mighty, or smells and bells is what sometimes later authors called it. You're familiar as an Anglican with some of that tension and could probably explain better than we could. They felt those tensions about, the wedding ring in marriage ceremony, the sign of the cross that was made on an infant's head at baptism. They felt that was just too Catholic, and just all those kinds of things. So they brought that list of grievances to James and said, here's issues that need fixed in the church. Well, James, for his part, as he comes to England, is a very, very wise king. He gets a bad rap and a bad press today sometimes but he was actually a brilliant politician. And he
Mm.
recognized England has all these tensions, and I don't want to come in and pick one side and just ruin everything. So I need to at least make a visible show of listening to all the complaints. So he decides to call the Hampton Court Conference. There has been at least one scholar that argued that the Millenary Petition was not connected in any way to the Hampton Court Conference, William Craig. I'm not sure I'd go that far. It is fair to say that the documents don't directly state that the Hampton Court Conference was called as a result of the Millenary Petition. That's fair. I'll grant him that. I do think there's some organic connection, though, between them.
Even if it's just the issues itself. The issues themselves would have presented themselves in a situation
exactly.
like that.
So whether it was directly that petition or just kind of in the air, the discontentedness that was there, James wisely decided to call a conference to hear Puritan complaints. And that leads us to the Hampton Court Conference in 1604.
Yeah, and Josh, kind of some of the complaints that the Puritans have, like Timothy was saying, they're pretty basic things that we would think, oh, that's what a Puritan would not want to do. Things like the wedding ring or the sign of the cross or the outfits. Kind of tell us a little bit about your understanding of their issues that they really wanted to see resolved. And what would you say are probably some of the most important ones that they wanted resolved, that they were hoping? And I actually believe they had in their mind that King James would give them quite a few of these. I think that's what they believed would happen.
Yeah. So, and we talked about this, a little bit even before the show, but, as much as we think of the Puritans as, even prudish people, they wanted just some normalcy with how their lives were governed and, how that would, play out, being any form of leadership within the church. So I think as we see them approaching King James and everyone bringing their request to him, we have hindsight of looking back and seeing how all the factions played out. Everyone at that point is vying for some form of control and some form of advancement for whatever cause they have. So just like we look today, at the landscape of evangelical America, and we see the different factions we have, we don't know how things are going to play out with this crowd and that crowd. So I think, looking at them, with a positive light, they're coming to King James really hoping that the changes they want to see will advance their cause beyond what we see it kind of tapering off, soon after that time of history.
Yeah, and I think within that, there were some people, Timothy, on the inside that were a part of the Church of England, because even when we covered the Trail of Blood, we were looking at John Smith and others that were a part of it. He kind of took a radical approach, but he had friends that followed him for a little bit, and then we're like, okay, you're a little bit too extreme. They ended up going back to the Church of England and writing against John Smith because there was this momentum in England where it's like, we see the problems with our church. And I think almost everyone acknowledged things needed to change a little bit. Yeah. There were things that were off. It's just how extreme did you want the changes? The Puritans typically were on the other extreme. They wanted almost anything that looked Roman Catholic to be gone.
Yeah.
And you did have some bishops that were sensible and in the middle. They kind of sympathized with the Puritans on the fact of, okay, we need to lose some of these things, but we cannot lose the sanctity of the church. It is an apostolic church. We do have succession. Kind of talk about the drama even within. So that's the Puritan side that you guys. Now let's move over to the bishops within the Church of England. They're being brought into this meeting. What kind of attitude do you think was going on in the hallways of the bishops of England who want to sympathize a little bit, but also hold to the church is a good church. It just has some bad things in it.
Yeah, that's a really good way to frame it. I do think we tend sometimes to paint two sharp poles, conformist and nonconformist. And that's an accurate depiction in some ways. There were, like you said, the bishops that were tied to apostolic succession and that really just hated the Puritans. And Richard Bancroft would have been chief among them, kind of known as the hammer of Puritans. And we'll talk more about Bancroft later, I'm sure. But just that really despised Puritanism and hated it. And then we have those Puritans that were just extremely radical, as you say, in their views. Essentially, some of them essentially wanted to separate from or even abolish the Church of England. But we do need to be careful. If there are two poles, and I think there are, that's fair to say, but those poles maybe aren't always as far apart as we tend to think, because there was definitely a segment in the middle that was much, much more moderate in both of those parties. So, for example, Peter Lake wrote a marvelous work for Cambridge years ago called Moderate Puritans and the Elizabethan Church. And he actually zooms in on Lawrence Chatterton, who was a King James translator and one of the individuals at the Hampton Court Conference, as an example of these Puritans that weren't so radical and that were just fine with continuing to wear vestments if necessary, to use the Book of Common Prayer in worship, So there is those two outward poles, but there's also definitely a central segment that was a little bit more moderate and forgiving of one another, might be another way to put it. So I'll mention one other work there too, actually on the Puritan side again, Patrick Collinson's magisterial dissertation on the Elizabethan Puritan movement, which has recently been republished by Routledge or however you say that name. It's unfortunately very expensive. But he does a really good job showing these people were all friends, even as they got together at Hampton Court. Yes, they're on opposite sides of ecclesiastical issues. But a number of them, they went to school together. They had known each other for decades. They were good friends. They liked each other. They hung out with each other. Even when they disagreed about ecclesiastical issues, there was definitely a central segment that was okay with befriending the other quote unquote side, so to speak. I think that was present there as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciate you bringing that up too. And that there were discussions where these guys sat down and debated like gentlemen.
Mm-hmm.
But then they also could sit in a meeting together without ripping each other's heads off. I think they were tired of that regime because of Mary, particularly, and how that went. Many of the bishops of England fled to places like Geneva for refuge. So I think they were kind of done with, hey, let's kill anybody that disagrees with this mindset, because they were seeking peace. But the question is, what are you going to let go of to get that peace? And I think that everybody involved here, both Puritans, even guys like Bancroft or people that are more in the middle, we're hoping that King James, I think truly we're hoping that he could bring all three groups together. I really think that's what they were hoping for.
Yeah.
Now, and I think King James was hoping to accomplish that. And I actually say of all the royalty up to that point, he did the most to accommodate, in as little as it was, accommodate to the Puritans. And so, Josh, you were actually talking about one of the translators who seemed to be sympathetic to Puritans. And then when you see him writing, particularly in the preface, it seems like he actually takes a distancing stand. So kind of explain who that is and why you personally think that would have been the case in a situation like that, because you also have politics here, and your name's going published. It'll change the way you look at your friends on paper versus who you sit with for dinner. So kind of talk about that.
Yeah, and another thing I was going to say too, as you guys were discussing that, and this is kind of leaping ahead to another part of our conversation with the translation, but we see the Puritans also having issues with words they want to see changed or added or revised in the translation that we're going to look at. I think it's just funny when you see their issues with, words between like church and congregation and bishop and elder, and just what an affront that was to the high church, bishops of the day, of, them thinking that would be conceded to, that every, petty objection they had to a certain word was going to be given to them. So yeah, that factors in. I think we see that almost cause a bit of a rift. King James definitely has, an attitude, I think, to some degree towards the Puritans. I cannot remember the quote, so I'm not going to cite anyone, but I heard someone say that when I was doing some study, that he was not impressed with the Puritans' arguments during the Hampton Court Conference.
No doubt.
And I think the quote that someone said is that James said, "If I were their tutor, I would have caned their posteriors myself." Something in the sense of he, even himself as a theologian and as a politician, was like sorely displeased with kind of their arguments they made. But back to your initial question, I'm looking for the quote that I sent you guys when we're kind of discussing this in a preliminary way. But in the preface, the Puritans are mentioned very briefly, and they're mentioned in kind of as a pest to some degree. Like, because these Puritans are asking for all these things, we decided to come together and try to find a middle ground. And it's interesting because Miles Smith is the one that most people agree upon is, the author, the one who penned the preface. There's some debate whether, is the preface expressing Miles Smith's thoughts or all the translators' thoughts?
Right.
There's a lot of politicalness in there of, is he just kind of kissing up to the king and the future printers that are going to be putting this out? There's some legitimateness to some different views of that. Either way, I think what we want to focus on in this discussion is even the preface reveals that the Puritans were some form of a nuisance that were being appeased to some degree, by and large, by those, looking at their objections that they had And I think it's funny that even finds its way into the preface to some degree of them being referenced in not the most lovingly way.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think that the Puritans, in my opinion, based on what we do have of the actual declaration they sent to the king, again, we thankfully have more than what we probably had a few years back, and we know more than we did a few years back. Some of the stuff I think they were asking for, it's like, okay, and again, I'm not living back then, and I don't face the issues they face. I think I would have taken, like, what's the 10 biggest things we have an issue with? And let's start with the smallest amount of lists we can give to the king. I don't know if I would have put as many things. I think the Puritans went way too far in their request. I'm just like, to me, I want to start out moderate. Like, hey, these main things bother us the most. Is there a way that we could do our baptisms like this? Instead, they just kind of they just bulldozed all of it. Like, we don't like this. We don't like this. We don't like this. And I don't know. I think they didn't take the best approach to trying to persuade the king. I don't know, Timothy, you've probably read way more on that than me, but I think that they kind of went at it full blow instead of maybe let's see if he gives us an inch and then we can go the mile.
Yeah. So that's a really helpful perspective. There are actually kind of two different takes among scholarship about precisely that question. Were the Puritan delegates the 4 men that were chosen to represent Puritanism at the conference? And we can talk in a minute if you want to about kind of the structure and when they showed up and all that. But when they made their request, were they asking too much? Or, and at least one author has advanced the opposite view, were they actually asking for too little? Did they secretly want a much more radical reformation, but they were so cautious in what they did ask for that James makes one statement at the conference, according to William Barlow, where he says, well, if this is all that you were wanting to try, I'm paraphrasing, if this is all that you were wanting, why'd you trouble me with it? So there are two different takes in the literature on the question. Did they ask for too much and that backfire? Or did they actually, in fact, ask for too little and that backfired? But either way, I think you were exactly right, Joshua, in terms of James's response. There has been a tendency in scholarship to claim that James was very, very amenable to what the Puritans were asking for, that he was very Puritan friendly, so to speak. And there has been really just one voice or two voices that have argued against that. Alan Cromarty, I don't know if I'm saying his name correctly. He wrote a little article in this book, James the Sixth and First, and he admits his very opening line is to say, I'm going to argue against what everybody else thinks. I think James didn't give the Puritans an inch, that he was Laudian, William Laud, however you pronounce that name, High Church, later one of the fathers of the High Church movement. He said that James essentially was strictly anti-Puritan. And he quotes and brings out the quote that you were talking about earlier, and I dug it up while you were talking and found it in a letter from James that James wrote the second day of the conference to another individual. He said this to Lord Henry Howard. And I do have this on my website, but I just clicked on the link and I remembered I had a link that you could actually go and view the actual document that James wrote in his own handwriting. But the British Library website has been down for about a month and a half, so it doesn't work right now. But I do have the transcript here that you can still see. So I'll just read that quote that you were talking about earlier. James said this to Henry Howard: "We have kept such a revel with the Puritans here these 2 days as was never heard the like, where I have peppered them as soundly as ye have done the papist there. They fled me so from argument to argument without ever answering me directly, as is their custom, as I was forced at last to say unto them that if any of them had been in a college disputing with their scholars, if any of their disciples had answered them in that sort, they would have fetched him up in place of a reply, and so should the rod have plied upon the poor boy's buttocks."
Yes, yeah, that's it. Yeah,
in light of a statement like that and several others, I think Cromarty is right, and that it's really hard to say that James was super. I think he might have put on a front of being.
I think so.
The Puritans. Yeah, but in terms of his personal views, I think they come out in his letter. And in his personal views, I think he was pretty staunchly anti-Puritan. He was a good moderator. He was a great politician, so he knew, hey, I have to make a forward face of listening.
Of course.
But in terms of his own attitudes, I think he was pretty staunchly anti-Puritan.
Yeah, everybody, and Josh, I'll let you chime in on that. But everybody, I mean, if you're being tasked with taking a divided England, that Elizabeth did a lot to help, but they're still divided on practice, particularly in the church, and their freedom to do it. He can't just come in and just dismiss one. I mean, he's gonna have to. I mean, his personal prejudice will come out at some point. It's typically in a personal letter. But when you're making public statements, it's going to be like, yeah, let's just, let's all come together and let's try to settle this. And it seems like that's what he's a politician. I mean, that's what politicians do. I mean, Josh,
well, let me add there.
No,
sorry.
Go for it.
Go ahead, Josh.
No, go ahead, Tim. Finish.
As you just said that, a thought came to my mind. I was going to say, scholars who write about James used to claim that he was a horrible failure and a horrible king. And a scholar by the name of Jenny Wormold, who passed away years ago, she wrote a seminal article called Two Kings or One about James. And she really rehabilitated James, basically saying what you just said. He was actually a consummate politician. And if you stop and think about this fact, almost as soon as James passed away and his son took the throne, those tensions that were still present erupted into the English Civil Wars, right? And you get this massive decades-long battle. And James has to be recognized as successful, at least in this. While all those tensions existed during his whole reign, war never broke out. No. He kept peace. So I just wanted to plug that in.
That is an excellent point, because James's son was, I think, foolish in how he handled most of those things. I think his dad did a much better job holding the peace. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, I found the quote when you guys were talking as far as how this relates to the Hampton Court Conference and the translation of the King James Bible. So this is Miles Smith penning it in the preface of us wondering, what's his view? What's the royal view of the Puritans? So listen to this excerpt from the preface. He says, "For the historical truth is that shortly after His Majesty's coronation, the Puritans made their urgent petitions at the conference at Hampton Court was arranged so that their complaints might be heard." I just think it's funny. Even it's not just, their legitimate desires. It's complaints, I mean, let's hear these guys out. They got all these issues, and look at how he builds more upon it. When by force of reason, they were made to retreat from other grounds, at last they had this excuse, that they could not with good conscience subscribe to the communion, the book, because it was a Bible and a translation, which was, as they said, a most corrupted translation. And although this was judged to be but a very poor and empty excuse, His Majesty, nevertheless, began to think of the benefit that may ensue from a new translation, and presently afterwards he gave order for this translation, which is now presented to you. This we write to satisfy our more scrupulous brethren, which is the Puritans there.
He's definitely talking about the Puritans in that point. Yeah. And so this kind of leads into... So the meeting, so that takes us into this section, Timothy. So what Bible, what translation were they particularly talking about right there? What's their issue? Why are they raising? So he recognizes, okay, they have this issue. And so now the suggestions coming in. So that kind of leads into the days of this meeting, day 1, day 2. What becomes the problem? Why are the Puritans swinging in this? We need a new translation idea. That was not probably a part of their original petition.
Yeah.
So where did all this come from? Take us through day 1. Day 1, we're at the Hampton Court.
Great question. Yeah. So day 1 at Hampton Court, when we talk about the Hampton Court Conference, we have to recognize several things that happened. It was scheduled to take place earlier. I forget the date, but I think in like December, maybe even way earlier than that. And because the plague had hit London, they had to reschedule it. So they moved the original date. And there was a royal proclamation that was passed. Hughes and Larkin have it. You can get a hold of it today still in the official published reprints of the royal proclamations. He made a royal proclamation, that because of the plague, things would have to change. So the date was changed, but exactly what the new date would be wasn't really clear and specific. So on Thursday, January the 12th, all of the bishops showed up, only to find out that there had been confusion that it wasn't supposed to start that day. But James still met with them. So James lets the bishops in, the kind of conformist representatives, and essentially has a pre-conference meeting with them that none of the Puritan representatives or spokesmen are present for. So in some ways, the whole conference is decided there at that sort of accidental pre-conference meeting before the Puritan complaints, to use Smith's word there that you quoted, the complaints, they haven't even been heard. They haven't had a chance to speak their voice. And James already says, okay, here's what we're going to do in the conference. Here's the big 3 heads. Here's what we're going to treat. Here's what we're going to decide. So the Puritan spokesmen are already coming in at a serious, not home field advantage, but disadvantage, playing on someone else's court. So then on that first day of the conference, they show up officially ready to join, and they aren't allowed to come in. They're kept outside the door of the main room where the conference takes place. And James, again, just meets with the bishops on official day 1 of the conference. And it's not until the second day that the Puritans even get a chance to have an audience with the king. So again, I think that argues for that notion that you mentioned earlier, that really, in a sense, there's a very real sense in which James was snubbing the Puritans. Yes, he wanted to let them have their day in court, so to speak, but they weren't really a part of the intimate workings of what was going on at the conference. They really
The jury
only showed up
already
for day 2.
decided.
Yeah, the jury had already decided.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't that interesting then? Because when you look at this, that would lean to me that they were fully aware of this petition that was going around, the Millenary Petition, that they would have had full knowledge of it, already knew the arguments, and already had their minds made up about certain things before the Puritans even got to present them. So it doesn't seem to me that the Puritans were presenting anything that they weren't expecting anyway. So they'd already felt like they could presuppose what was going to be said in that meeting. So they went ahead and made some decisions. It's like, hey, we'll bring them in and let them talk. You guys work back there. In the meanwhile, we're moving forward with or without them.
Yeah. Well, and let me say, I just realized I didn't answer the second part of your question there.
Go for it.
When it comes to like the specific request for the Bible, I got stuck on the first part of your question.
No,
and
you're
didn't
good.
answer the second part. Where did that request come from? This idea for a new Bible. Well, the complaint from the passage that we just read there from Smith is specifically talking about the Book of Common Prayer, which is the essential text for liturgy in the Church of England and its major formulary, or one of its 4 major formularies. In the Book of Common Prayer, the text that was being quoted there, largely the Great Bible, they felt there were problems in, well, okay, let me say this. They said that they felt that there were problems in the translation that was being employed in the Book of Common Prayer. So therefore, what Smith paints is, this is his take. He says at the conference, what happened was that at the very last, they had recourse to this shift, which was judged to be but a poor and empty shift. And that's complex language. Here's what I think he's saying. You could argue against me. I think he's saying they were trying to get their suggestions approved. None of them worked. So their last-ditch Hail Mary was to say, well, you need to give us at least a new Bible, because the Bible that's in the Book of Common Prayer is corrupt. And, John Reynolds lists 3 examples, according to William Barlow's account, of places where there are corruptions in the text. So therefore, we have to have a new Bible. I think part of what's going on here was this. The big issue at that time for the nonconformists was subscription, signing on that you agree completely with the Book of Common Prayer, and therefore you're going to use it in worship, right? That's how you're going to structure your services. They didn't like that. I think we can show that for a long time, there was sort of a legal loophole that some Puritans were making use of, where they were saying, oh, well, I can't subscribe to the Book of Common Prayer. I can't sign on the dotted line because the Bible translation is a problem. And this became kind of a common way of them saying, oh, well, I would subscribe, I'd sign, I'd do it all that way, except for my problems with the Bible translation. If that's so, then what Smith is suggesting is that there was an insincerity in their request when John Reynolds makes this request for a new Bible.
I take it.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of debate in the literature about that. Was it a sincere request? That was what David Norton argued. And then Mordecai Feingold recently wrote an article where he says, actually, I think John Reynolds was sincere. So it's a really heavily debated point. But I think what we can say for sure, Smith is painting it as an insincere petition, that it's basically just a legal loophole that they're playing and throwing out. A good part of the evidence for that is the recognition, which you mentioned a moment ago. If we look at the Millenary Petition, and there's a dozen or so other petitions from Puritans in that era coming to James. If we look at those petitions, and I've looked at every one of them I've ever been able to find, there's not a single mention of a request for a new Bible in any of them. And there's certainly not in the Military Petition, which I did want to mention this earlier and I forgot. But this interesting work by David Sorensen that just came out last year, The Faithful Word, it's a tracing of the creation of the King James Bible. And I'm just going to read one paragraph just from the back cover. You don't even have to read the book itself to know that this is going to be a problematic volume. He says this, or someone summarizing his book says this: the author presents a captivating history of James Stewart, aka King James, who was in all probability the most godly king since Josiah. Okay, well, that could be debated, but the reader will learn, if they buy this book, we're told, the reader will learn how 1,000 Puritan preachers persuaded James to authorize a new translation of the Bible. Oh, come on. I mean, I want to be nice to Dr. Sorensen, but that's just that is a statement from someone incredibly ignorant of the source material. The Military Petition, and I have read I've looked at in my hands at least one of the handwritten copies that were made in that early time. We don't have the original again, but I've read it and I've put the text up on my website. You can read it. There's not a single mention there of a request for a new Bible. So the notion that that petition was even asking for one is just off the face of it wrong. And then there's really serious problems about the idea that maybe there would have been 1,000 people. I think what's more likely is that Smith is right. Smith is, I think, an accurate recounting, who's onto something when he says this was an insincere request thrown in at the last minute as kind of a Hail Mary and a way to get revisions made to the Book of Common Prayer. I could be wrong about that, but that's my take on it.
But that just goes to show, so if you're talking about the Great Bible there, which it was King Henry VIII that authorized that back in the 1538, I think, or something like that. When you're looking at the Great Bible, for them to pull that move, it would seem like to me that everybody universally kind of had an issue with the translation to begin with, because there has always been accusations that in its revisions there were inconsistencies.
Yeah.
So I wonder, like Josh, what Timothy was saying is this is kind of a Hail Mary. It's like, okay, we can all at least agree on this. The Great Bible being used within the citations of the public readings and the ceremonies is bad, and therefore give us a bone here. So
yeah,
it does seem like they knew that all the bishops that were probably across the hallway had the same common complaint, or they'd have never brought this up to be a Hail Mary if they didn't believe something would catch. What do you think?
So what I think too, here's another side of the context. We have, the High Church Bible on the one side, but I think we need to consider the impact of the Geneva Bible at this time as well.
Yes.
That's the Bible of the people. I mean, that's the King James of the day, in a sense, the way, the King James has been for, many believers for the past several hundred years. And by and large, we see King James almost getting a light bulb of interesting. If we appease both sides, this will help quell people having access to the Geneva Bible. Because if we get these Puritans to be okay with this, then they can't argue that they want to read the Geneva Bible. And for those of you that don't know, and I'm sure you guys do, but one of the biggest grievances that James had with the Geneva Bible was the marginal notes. They were notes that always referenced the king in a negative way.
Yes.
And so it's funny, I have here kind of a modern English translation of the Geneva Bible. And I enjoy reading it sometimes and reading the footnotes. But here in Exodus, where, the Israelites are being told, the Hebrews are being told to kill their children. And the marginal note at the bottom is praising the midwives for not killing them. And it says that they obeyed God because they could not keep from the rage of the tyrant. So you have notes like that, and you have in Hebrews and Romans, the passages about respecting authority. There's always kind of a jab of like, yeah, but you don't have to if he's going against God. So James obviously sees himself as the supreme leader, the supreme authority. He should never be opposed. So I think he sees this as an opportune time to kill two birds with one stone, of getting rid of the Geneva's prevalence while also getting the Puritans to subscribe to a middle ground book.
And so with that, Timothy, did they shoot themselves in the foot there? Because would the Puritans not have recommended, if they could have picked a translation to be inserted in any of the liturgical work, would it not have been the Geneva? And because the result they were probably hoping to get out of this, I don't think they got out of the King James Version, because a lot of them ended up complaining later on it was too high church. And they ended up sticking with Geneva. So did they shoot themselves in the foot here a little bit?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And there is at least one major scholar, David Norton, has argued, I don't think he invented the argument, but he certainly has been the main figure to popularize it. He has suggested that if you look really closely at the example passages that John Reynolds brings up when he makes a request and says, hey, there are examples of corruption in our Bible, therefore we need a new translation. And he gives 3 examples, and I've got these spelled out, I think, somewhere on my website. If you read those closely, David Norton suggests that he's chosen carefully some examples that make the Geneva Bible look really good. And so Norton has argued for years that essentially what Reynolds was doing was saying, the Bible's corrupt that's in our prayer book now. So hint, hint, what if we just adopted the Geneva Bible as the official Bible in the prayer book, and then everybody would be happy, right? The conformists would be fine because we're still using the prayer book, and we would be fine because now we've got our Geneva text officially sanctioned. I used to agree with Norton. Today, I'm a little bit more hesitant. There's a dissertation by a gentleman by the name of Cameron McKenzie, who has argued that the Geneva Bible was much more highly regarded among conformists at the time and was almost a de facto authorized translation already. But yeah, I do think as they're making that request, it's certainly possible that they have in mind the idea that the Geneva Bible itself would be authorized. And I do think it's fair to say that when James consents to the idea of a new translation, it does backfire in a very real sense in two ways. One, Josh just mentioned there, James had this hatred for notes, the notes of the Geneva Bible, especially because of, and here's the thing that we need to understand, he wasn't opposed to the idea that the text would be explained or exegeted. Obviously, if we look at the King James, we can see, marginal references are included. Occasionally, even textual variants are brought up in the notes, which I just wrote a post the Text and Canon Institute shared that gives a few examples of those where textual variants are raised in the margins. But what James was opposed to was anti-monarchical notes. That's what Joshua was explaining there really clearly. So I think here's what backfire on them then. When James commissioned a new translation or a revision, what became a revision of the Bishop's Bible, the number one thing that he wanted everybody to keep in mind was, and he said it directly at Hampton Court, this will be a Bible with no notes. Yeah. And in fact, I've been collecting for the last year or two accounts of the Hampton Court Conference. And I think the other day, I just found another one today. I spent about 6 or 7 hours digging to finally find where it was in the archives, and I found it. I've known about it for a long time, but just finally found it. So I've looked at a little over 40 accounts of the Hampton Court Conference, and not every one of them, but almost every one of them that says anything about the translation. The one thing they'll say, there's going to be a new Bible, and it's not supposed to have notes. Yeah. So you get this sense as you read across the documents, this is something James emphasized very strongly. Okay, we'll give you a new Bible, but you're not going to put any of your Geneva-like anti-monarchical notes in it, not one. Yeah. So that rung out really loud and clear from the conference.
And I'll jump in here too to add to what you're saying. I have printed out here the 15 rules, for translation. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but this in a sense was kind of given to Bancroft from James.
Yeah, so there is some debate about that. I've actually been working through and transcribing. David Norton brought to attention 5 copies of those rules. I have, and then another scholar found one more a couple years ago in the Fine Cold volume. I've actually finished transcribing 12 copies now. So I've looked at them in a lot of detail. And yeah, this is just my opinion. My personal opinion is that Bancroft created those rules as he was put in charge of the translation, but directly with James in consultation. And he says at one point in one of the rules, His Majesty is very careful on this point. You get the idea that Bancroft's writing, but James is definitely overseeing.
I'm with you on that, because some of the sources when I was kind of studying for this is some people are saying these are rules given to Bancroft by James. Others were suggestions that Bancroft took and made into rules. Either way, here's rule number 6 is no marginal notes are to be affixed, but only the explanation of the Hebrew or Greek words, which cannot, without some circumlocution, so briefly and fitly be expressed in the text. So it is black and white that, to put it, as simply as we can understand in the modern day, he didn't want a, life application study Bible. He wanted an version of the Bible where it's like, hey, geek out on all the translation stuff, but I don't want anything coming back at me as the king from some weird application you got from the text,
Yeah, that's good. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and I think King James himself, and there were certain words that he made non-negotiables. Timothy, why don't you fill us in on some of those words that were not that actually do not work in favor of the Puritans? Because he would not budge on them.
That's right. I need to pull up and see if I can find the copy of the rules so I have it right in front of me, because he lists church versus congregation.
Baptize.
The phrase, baptize. So to understand that background, we have to step back a little bit to William Tyndale.
Yes.
Which, of course, William Tyndale creates the very first English translation from a Greek New Testament text. He translates from the 2nd and 3rd edition of Erasmus's printed Greek New Testament. It's the very first time that there's been English Bibles before, or sections of English Bibles at least, but it's the very first time that an English translation is made directly from the original languages of the Greek New Testament text in 1526. Well, William Tyndale gets in this huge battle with a major Catholic scholar that many people would know today from his Utopia, Sir Thomas More. And they get in this debate about words because Tyndale's willing to mess with language in some almost nonconformist ways. Tyndale was essentially a Lutheran. I don't think he claimed that title for himself, but theologically, he was essentially a Lutheran, part of the Reformation, and part of a figure bringing English Reformation into England. You know, of course, as the English Reformation takes off. He's before the English Reformation technically, but I think laying the groundwork for it. David Daniel argued for that at length in his book, The Bible in English, and I think he's essentially right. So Tyndale gets in this massive published written debate with Thomas More about a bunch of these sort of hot topic words. So, for example, should we translate bishop or just or elder or priest, or should we just more generically say senior or elder in a way that doesn't necessarily speak to like a specific church office? Well, that's a flashpoint of controversy in the day. A second one was church versus congregation. Because again, church has this idea in the Anglican conception, you can only have a church where there's a bishop. You've got to meet in our official building. But you get this sort of nonconformist trend that wants to meet, you know, as the evangelical revival later takes off. They want to meet out in the open air, anywhere. They don't need a bishop, and that's still a church too. Yeah. So Tyndale translates congregation. And it's a less official form of the word, and more in him debate and argue about that back and forth. One of the big back and forths is actually over the word that we should use to translate the Greek word agape. Which had traditionally from the Latin Vulgate been translated charity from caritas. Tyndale wanted to translate as love. He said, actually, charity doesn't mean the same thing. That doesn't convey the same sense to the text and doesn't have the same feel to your heart. So Tyndale's a very quote unquote modern translator in a sense. He translates love, but James through Bancroft or Bancroft in consultation with James, however, in these rules, they specifically state the old ecclesiastical words are to be kept. So they're talking about that debate. They're saying as that debate has gone on, and again, washing versus baptism is one of them, because, you know, again, in the official church, baptism is the word that would be used. That means this has to be something performed as a divine service following the Book of Common Prayer liturgy by an ordained minister, which is going to be, you know, either a priest or a bishop. But then there's that nonconformist strand that says, actually, it just means to dip, you know, and that's where the Baptist separatists come from later that you guys talked about in the Trail of Blood thing. That's not their only theological case, but part of their theological case is, hey, the word just means to dip. It doesn't mean we have to be in an official church service where a baby is, you know, sprinkled by a priest or a bishop. This is something that any believer out in the field who comes to Jesus can dip and immerse into the water. And of course, they developed that whole separatist and then Baptist strand from the Church of England in there. So these are hot topic words. Yeah. And James and Bancroft take a very hard line to say not allowed. And what that reveals, Josh, I think you said it so well. I think what that reveals is, while this translation has been brought about by Puritan complaints, this is from beginning to end going to be a conformist controlled Bible. Yes. Richard Bancroft is put in charge of it. He's the arch anti-Puritan. And it has, because of these rules, been essentially the Puritans are allowed to work on it, but they're tightly reined in.
Yes. And let me, Josh, jump on this, and then Timothy, you follow up, because I have heard entire sermons on why in 1 Corinthians 13, charity suffers long and is kind is right. And to put the word love there is to actually do damage and give a lesser meaning there. Then you actually get into the history of why they chose that word. It's not for all the reasons. I maybe you guys have not heard sermons on 1 Corinthians 13 defending the term charity in the King James by King James only. I most certainly have. Josh, what have you heard or experienced anything like that? Like, oh, well, no, this is the best possible word here. I mean, that's not really the argument that was even happening in England.
The argument you're making, I mean, when I was in King James only circles, I definitely heard that the whole, like, you know, love has a secular and a lustful connotation to it today. Charity doesn't carry with it. That's kind of what I would hear. You know, it's funny that whenever it was explained, it's like, but this is love. It's just good love is kind of how it was explained. I don't know. I've necessarily heard entire sermons on that.
Lucky you.
I guess I missed out on just one of those, I guess. So, Tim, how about you? I mean, have you been in any sermons where that's been kind of dissected like that?
Yeah. I don't know. Likewise, I don't think I've ever heard an entire sermon on it, but I have heard it mentioned literally dozens of times and defended. And I would just point out what you just said a minute ago, Stephen. That is not a modern debate, love versus charity. That's a debate that precedes the King James Bible. Yeah. And Tyndale was arguing passionately against More that love was the right word And the King James Bible took a specific stance, a very strong stance in the midst of that debate to say, nope, we're going to stick with the Latinized charity and its connotation and connection with the Latin Vulgate. I will say it's been a long time since I wrote on that, but I do have on my website, if you go to kjbhistory.com, there's a tab titled bloggingtheword.com. I used to have a different blog called Blogging the Word, and I wrote 2 or 3 blogs where I went through all that debate in detail, and I shared Thomas More's writings and William Tyndale's writings and kind of showed how that debate took place. But yeah, that rule that you just read earlier, Josh, about the old ecclesiastical words, it doesn't mention the word charity, but it's talking about those hot topic words, those fusion point words, we might call them, cracks, fissures in the church at the time. And charity was one of them. But James is taking a very specific stance.
But isn't it ironic that the reason that they were choosing these words are in opposition to those who tried to defend them? These are high church words. I mean, they're choosing to keep the high church road in terms like bishop instead of overseer, elder, etc., or to continue terms like this from Latin, which goes back to the Roman influence. And a lot of the people that are trying to defend these terms are defending them from independent fundamental Baptist backgrounds, none of which hold the term bishop, none of which hold the term that you're seeing here. Their reason for holding these were high church reasons against a pushback from the Puritans. And the independent Baptist would be probably the furthest extreme you could be in Puritanism. But yet they're defending a translation of high church words. It's almost mind-blowing.
I was going to say the same thing of that is one of the best ironies that the Lord in his providence has allowed is that the most anti-established church, anti-Protestant groups is the most advocate or the biggest advocate of their translation for those reasons that we're talking about right now. It makes me chuckle, honestly, to think about, how history shook out that way.
Yeah. None of them would want a king telling them which religion they can be a part of. None of them. No. I mean, they're usually the biggest patriots with the multiple American flags on stage. I mean, so it's just ironic how all that plays out. But there's also a lot of myths about King James himself, like his involvement in the translation. These are places where he would have been involved. Now, we know he was a very, very educated man. He had his own translations of like the Psalms and stuff that. I mean, but there are some people that are so naive that they get into that, well, he was involved. There's some that are actually against it, saying, I don't want a translation by, a king. It's like, well, okay, first of all, like he authorized it. He wasn't sitting there in the translation committees. He put Bancroft over pretty much that. So Timothy, kind of walk us through like the groups. They were kind of spread out. And this myth that they're all working together and making giant consensuses. That's not the way this went. That's the way I was taught. That's not the way it went. How much was King James involved? And actually, how did the process go?
Yeah, good question. So a couple of years ago, I wrote an article called 7 Myths on the King James Bible or something like that. And I remember I sat down and made a list of myths about the King James. And one of the ones I put in my list was the myth that James was either a translator or directly worked on the translation or translated the King James Bible himself. And I actually decided not to treat the myth for this reason. That used to be a really, really common idea out there that you would meet just the average man on the street. Tell me about the King James Bible. Oh, yeah, that's the one James wrote. In fact, Hannah and I were just watching a movie the other day or a TV show, and someone made that comment. I think maybe I was watching it by myself. I don't remember. But someone made that comment within the narrative. Oh, that's when James changed the Bible and translated it for himself. I do think that myth is less common today for one simple reason. In 2011, the 400-year anniversary of the King James, a lot of scholarship started being done on the King James Bible, and people became generally more aware of its history. So I don't encounter that a whole lot today. I used to hear it a lot. Today, I would probably only hear it from like someone who's completely disconnected from the church, but has heard about the King James Bible. But yeah, to answer it as a myth, James, I think, was heavily involved at the very start of the process. He clearly, I think, is crafting, as you said, Joshua, crafting these rules with Bancroft, directly overseeing what's taking place at first. He seems to have been pretty heavily involved in appointing the translators. We have a letter from him that was sent out, I can't remember, the July 20th or maybe to the 30th or maybe in the next month or two. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't remember. But James himself wrote a letter, which he sent through Bancroft to the other translators to say, I've appointed 54 translators. So he seems to be pretty heavily involved at the start of the process. But in terms of how the actual work takes place, he just almost seems to disappear from view after that
Mhm.
point. And there are a couple different reasons that could be. I think this is my personal opinion. I have not tried to prove this in writing yet. I think one of the reasons, well, let me mention two reasons. One of them has been proven in writing. Ken Fincham wrote an article called Bible and Crown, originally a lecture in 2011 for that anniversary. And then I think he revised it in like 2020 or 2021, something like that. He pointed out that essentially what shifted was the death of Bancroft, when Bancroft died just before the King James Bible was finished. So
Yeah, 1 year,
the
right?
king,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
1 year, 1610.
Yeah, 1610 or 1609. I don't remember. Somewhere right towards the very end of the process. But Bancroft has been in charge of this process the whole time. James appoints him. We know at least by the 22nd of July in 1604, Bancroft has been appointed over the translation project. So he's the driving force, the overseer. And he's actually mentioned in the preface at one point with a Greek word that means something to the effect of the overseer or the president of the whole project. It's a word from the Septuagint that they use to refer to him. So he's in charge of the whole thing, and then he dies. That might be one reason. Ken Fincham argues that that's one reason why James just sort of stepped away from the project. He'd given it all to Bancroft, and Bancroft sort of ran with it until Bancroft's death. I think a second reason, too, I have not tried to argue this in writing yet, but I would like to one day. James got very heavily involved in the oath of allegiance controversy. So when James first took the throne, again, he's listening to Catholics come and say, hey, are you going to be more friendly to us? And he's making them promises. In fact, James works very hard for what William Patterson called the reunion of Christendom. This is a marvelous monograph that I recommend to anyone by W.B. Patterson, who traces out the idea that James's overriding passion when he took the throne, he had this massive grand ambition. He was going to heal, H-E-A-L, the division between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. He actually tried to call, and Patterson demonstrates this at length with primary source documents, he tried to call another ecumenical council. He said, it's time for another ecumenical council to heal the divide. But here's the thing, since I'm the king of Great Britain, and he styled himself the king of Great Britain, I'm the king of Great Britain, and I'm, taking they don't use the word yet then as much, Anglican throne, which is where the king is the head of the church. Yep. Therefore, all of Christianity will reunite around me. Well, of course, Roman Catholics didn't exactly buy that idea. They're not exactly accepting the idea that James will be the new de facto pope. So he kind of ends up cracking down on the Roman Catholics in what's known as the Oath of Allegiance controversy. He puts together this oath, and it's on my website somewhere in 1605 or 1606. I forget the exact dates, shortly after the King James Bible gets started. And he says, okay, well, if you're going to be a Catholic in my land, you have to subscribe to the oath of supremacy and recognize that I'm the true head of the church. Well, come on. What good, faithful Roman Catholic is going to say, no, the Bishop of Rome's not in charge. It's actually King James, our good old English king, that's in charge. The Catholics didn't want to subscribe. They didn't want to sign on the dotted line, so to speak. And that whole period of many years is known as the Oath of Allegiance controversy. So there's a bunch of the King James translators, in fact, are enlisted. And James says, hey, I want you to write about it. I want you to write about it. And they're arguing against major Roman Catholic apologists. And I think this isn't something, again, that I've developed anywhere, but I'd like to someday. I think James was really excited about the project at first and maybe thought, hey, I can reunite all of Christianity, including Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, around a new Bible, and I'll just be the head of everything. And as the Oath of Allegiance controversy took off, I think he got a little bit more embarrassed of the project because Roman Catholics loved it. And here's why. At the Hampton Court Conference, when Reynolds said, our English Bibles are corrupt, James agreed. He didn't think about what that meant at the time. He's like, yeah, okay, all the English translations are corrupt. The Geneva Bible is the worst of all, he says. I don't think he had any clue what he was saying. But if you read Roman Catholic accounts, and this is something I'm going to bring out in a paper that I hope to publish before too long. My supervisor, I just talked with him yesterday for the first time face-to-face and told him a little bit about it. So he's going to look over it and hopefully help me publish it. I think if you read the Roman Catholic accounts of the Hampton Court Conference, the one thing that they all emphasize is the king admitted that all the Protestant Bibles are corrupt.
Yeah.
That's what Roman Catholics have been saying for decades, right? They're saying, you Protestants.
Yeah.
They've been claiming, you Protestants have been following a corrupt Bible. That's why you've got way off track and you're schismatics and heretics. James didn't mean to say any of that, I don't think. But at the Hampton Court Conference, when he said, all the English Bibles are corrupt, the Geneva is the worst of them, he had unwittingly, given them the ammo to turn around and say, even the king has officially declared that the Bible translations are corrupt. So this is just a personal opinion, but I think James was probably a little bit maybe embarrassed is not the right word, but it just became a really touchy issue in the midst of the oath of allegiance controversy. Oh man, I've technically given them this massive weapon against me, so maybe I'll just distance myself from that project a little bit. And I think that's probably why the Bible never got officially, quote unquote, authorized by James.
Yeah, and it's interesting with that, Josh, because that kind of shows James's own view of his own translation that he authorized to the translators themselves. That's a good headway right into this. Did they believe that any translation before them was perfect? And did they believe they were doing a perfect job? Because that's your question. And then Timothy, I'm going to come back with this. I forget. Don't let me forget.
Okay.
They disagreed with themselves about decisions on words, and Bancroft specifically, because we'll come back to that. But Josh, start with if what Timothy's saying is true, and that would be very, very interesting. He obviously didn't believe he was authorizing something perfect at all.
Yeah. Right.
What did the translators themselves believe they were doing in relation to a perfect translation or the lack thereof?
Right. So if we want to just kind of distill what we're reading from Miles Smith, speaking on behalf of the translators of their work, which I think is legitimate because they have all agreed upon this final translation. So it's expressing what they have, finished. And there's a quote that you and I talked about a bit before, Stephen, but I'll read it to you. They said in their preface, the translators to the reader, it says, "Also a man may be called handsome, although he has some warts upon his hand. Yes, and not only freckles upon his face, but also scars. There is no reason why the word, when translated, should be denied to be the word or forbidden to be circulated, even though some imperfections and blemishes may be found in the expression of it." I think two big takeaways from that is, number one, historically at that time, they're not claiming to be making, in a sense, the alternate perfect version to the Dewey Rhymes or whatever edition we're at with the Catholic Bible, the Vulgate at the time. And they mention in the preface, they're kind of throwing some shade a little bit at the Pope and their translations, talking about how they think it's perfect, but it's not. So we see here in the preface that they're acknowledging right off the bat, guys, we're not trying to tell you that we're making some perfect translation.
Yeah.
And they argue it based upon past translations. I think this is actually great argumentation. They're saying, listen to this quote about the Septuagint. They say, "It is certain that the Septuagint was not completely sound and perfect. In many places, it needed correction. And who was more qualified for this work than the apostles? Yet it seemed good for the Holy Spirit to take what they found, since it was for the most part true and sufficient, rather than to make a new translation in those early days of the church. This would have exposed them to many objections and criticisms if they had made a new translation of their own." So I think it's very interesting that they are building upon the fact of no translation has ever been perfect. So we're not trying to claim anything new at this point. That's really groundbreaking for destroying even a King James only understanding of, don't give them more credit for doing something they didn't take credit for doing.
Yeah, and Timothy, that they weren't starting something brand new anyway.
Yeah.
Did not
right.
King James author them to do this with the Bishop's Bible?
That's right. Yeah. So I think that was probably determined on July 22nd. I don't think that was decided at Hampton Court, but we do know that by July 22nd, and maybe on that day, when James sends out his list of rules, that first rule is the ordinary Bible that's been used in church, commonly called the Bishop's Bible. And I'm paraphrasing it here a little bit because I don't have it right in front of me right now. But that rule states that text is to be taken as the base and only altered as little as necessary.
Yeah.
So in other words, when we think of how Bible translations are made, sometimes a translation is made fresh from a Greek or Hebrew text. Correct. That's what Tyndale does in 1526. Sometimes a translation takes a prior translation and just revises it. Which of those is the King James? Well, in its core essence, it's a revision. It does still do fresh translation work, but at its core, it's a revision of the 1602 Bishop's Bible. And I did, like I think I mentioned earlier, I may have forgot, but there is a blog post I just got put up yesterday at the Text and Canon Institute that actually walks through the 1602 Bishop's Bible that we still have extant today, that's in the Bodleian, where it has collected together the notes that record the revisions of the King James translators as they're revising the Bishop's Bible. So you can see very clearly, and we put some images in that blog post, and you can also click on it and just go look at the whole document yourself now. It's online freely, which is wonderful. It didn't used to be. And you can see for yourself, they're starting with the Bishop's Bible text and making revisions to it. They're crossing things out that they want to get rid of. They're adding things into the margin that they want to add, which tells us that the King James Bible at its core essence, and that's not the only thing that tells us this, but it illustrates it for us. It's a revision. And what that means is the King James translators cannot have been opposed to the idea of revising Bible translation. Like if they are themselves producing a revision, then they can't be opposed to the idea of further revision, right? Like that just doesn't work.
Yeah. And by the way, the blog that that Timothy keeps referring to, I have in the comments, and I also have a link on Amazon to Josh's book. So
great.
If those that are listening, just go to the comments, you can find exactly what they're referencing. Sorry, go ahead.
So I would just say that makes it really clear, and that's just one of a number of things that make it really clear that they are opposed to the idea of a perfect translation.
And so within that, they break up into groups. They go to Cambridge, they go to Westminster, I believe, and Oxford. Am I missing one? Was it 3?
No, that's it. So I think there are 2 different ways to count. Some people count 3 committees. Some of the early writings just say that they divided into 3 groups. Some people count 6. And I think that's harmonized if we just realize there were 3 locations, Cambridge, Westminster, and Oxford. And at each location, there was a Hebrew team of specialists and a Greek team of specialists. So, I mean, you get guys that specialize in a particular language, and they parcel it out then amongst those 6 groups at those 3 locations, and they work together on the text.
Which shows, Josh, that they were not sitting there in a big committee taking consensus on every single word they chose to revise.
Right? Yeah. So this is something I really have been wanting to say, and I think we're at the perfect point now for this. I think a lot of misconception about the King James translation, not even among King James onlyists, I would say just people at large that are just, not purposely ignorant about this, but they think that this translation was put together word for word from the Greek and Hebrew of let's open up this one Greek manuscript and translate that into English. Old Testament time. Let's get this one perfect Hebrew text and translate it. I'm not even kidding you that even in the last week, a good friend of mine who I respect and is a smart guy, but he's kind of still in this realm of things and starting to see a lot of holes with it. He even told me, he said, I am just now realizing that there is not some 1-for-1 Greek right into English and then Hebrew right into English, text that it came from. And I think it's interesting that rule number 14 for the translator says, these translations to be used when they agree better with the text than the Bishop's Bible are to be Tyndale's, Coverdale's, Matthew's, White Church, Geneva. But we also, and this is my opinion, and Tim, add to this what you think. I think we see points as well where the Contemplatium Polyglot is referenced. I think we see times when the Vulgate is even referenced, and that is annotated in the side as well. We even have some degree of textual emendation where they're kind of, deciding at what point, do we go with this text or that when we don't find it. James Price has a phenomenal volume on textual emendations in the King James Version, and his book called King James Onlyism, A New Sect. And he was one of the chief editors on the New King James Version. I think it's James Price was his name. So I think I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, but I'm doing that intentionally to show this was a much more complicated translation process than, hey guys, where do we leave off yesterday? Let's just translate the next word and move forward. Oh, it's tea time, and get the crumpets ready, put a bookmark there. We'll come back to that perfect Greek volume and go word for word tomorrow. But I'm convinced so many people think that is how the King James was translated.
Yeah.
Timothy, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So there's a great volume that just came out maybe a year or 2 ago called Scribes in Scripture by John Mead and Peter Gurry, some friends of mine, great scholars. And one of the most valuable things about their book is that they take on kind of this assumption that you're talking about there, that people have in their minds that Bible translation is Bible transmission in terms of how scribes copy, and then Bible translation is in terms of how it comes into English, is just this science of exact verbal perfection. And in my opinion, one of the great strengths of their book is that they really show Bible transmission and Bible translation. They're messy endeavors.
Yeah.
They're a bunch of
Oh.
fallen, broken human beings with imperfect memories.
Yes.
And that's not to say that God's not there in the process. He is. We believe in God's providence. We believe in God's supernatural control of the events of the world, including a supernatural oversight over scribes and over translators. But when it comes to the nitty-gritty details, we just need to acknowledge, if we're going to be honest with the data, and I think honest with a good theology of providence, things were messy. Bible translation and Bible transmission is a messy endeavor, and that is just as true of the King James Bible as it is of any other Bible translation. Bible translators aren't perfect. They disagree with each other. They fight. They argue. They have right ideas and wrong ideas and sort of in the middle ideas. And Bible translation is just messy. And the King James translation, as it was produced as a revision of the Bishop's Bible, it was also messy.
Yeah. And Timothy, one example I know in the past we've talked about where the committee was going to go a direction, and it seems like Bancroft made a change. One of the ones I think I'm in my mind is maybe Luke 2:22, where there was a big debate about her purification, because there's a variant there, her, or is it there?
Yeah.
And so this is if I'm, and you tell me if I'm wrong, this is a statement where the committee that was working in Luke went a direction, and Bancroft actually changed it, or revised it, or made an edit, because he had the authority to do that. If I'm not mistaken, he was allowed to change things to keep within these rules, so to speak. But was it the bishops that they were going to change, and he changed it back? Kind of bring back my memory.
Yeah.
That one.
So I'd want us to keep two separate issues apart. One is those revisions that the companies are making as the King James Bible is being created. It goes through three basic stages. First, these 6 companies get to work, and they're revising a text of the Bishop's Bible, but just a select portion of the Bible. They're given, one chunk of the text and said, work on this text. So that happens for several years.
Gospels.
Yeah. The one group takes, a section of the New Testament. The other group takes a half of the New Testament. The other Greek group takes the Apocrypha, and so on. So they parcel it out. That goes on for several years, and then those revisions are shipped to the general meeting in London at Stationers' Hall. And I've been to Stationers' Hall. It's a beautiful little spot. You can walk into the room where they work. And at Stationers' Hall, there's just 12 men. We have 50, maybe closer to 60, depending on how you count people working in that first company stage. But when you come to this revision at Stationers' Hall, there's just 12 men, and it's 2 men that have been selected as delegates from every company and sent to that meeting. And they go over the whole biblical text and make revisions. Then there's a third step that I just call final edits. And that's after those 12 men that have put it together. We do have Miles Smith, which Josh has mentioned and explained for us, puts together this preface, and then Thomas Bilson as well. They put together all the prefatory material, all the marginal notes, the preface, the dedication to the king. They insert all the maps and genealogies and liturgical stuff that's in the front and so on. And Bancroft, I think, is a part of that process as the final editor. But we do want to keep 2 things separate. How much did Bancroft shape the text? Well, there's a very early tradition. It doesn't date so far back that we can establish it in like 1605 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or whatever. But it does show up within just a few decades of that. There's this complaint that Bancroft has changed the text in 14 places in an ecclesiastical direction. So again, remember, he's the arch anti-Puritan. And so as Puritans are arguing about this text, we can see a bunch of them complaining about the readings in the King James Bible. And whether this is true or not is a little harder to say, because we can't go all the way back in time. But it does show up within a few decades of 1611. And they're saying Bancroft, at first it's anonymous prelates. The prelates made these changes. Then later it's identified specifically Bancroft was in charge of these changes. So that's one tradition, and I think a very, very plausible scenario. He did die before the project was completely finished. So some people would say, oh, well, he couldn't have had a final exercise in hand. But honestly, at that point, the revisions were probably mostly already made, and it was just that paratextual stuff being put together. So I think there's a very good possibility that he did exercise that veto power, so to speak, in 14 passages. That tradition, to me, has a ring of truth to it. But then we do have to make a distinction between those particular 14 passages that an allegation is made about and other passages that are just being changed in the process of this 3-stage revision. I would put Luke 2:22 in that other category of just
Second
changes.
stage.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of, I wouldn't identify it as a change that has any reason to have been a Bancroft change, but I do think it's really clear when we look at the evidence. It's a passage where there's a textual variant that clearly some of the King James translators disagreed about. And we know that because of the copy of the Bishop's Bible that their decisions are recorded on. If you look at that today and you go to that blog you mentioned earlier, you can see the image. The Bishop's Bible text says her purification, referring to Mary. And the idea is the Old Testament Levitical code had required, a ritual purification process after birth. Mary, of course, has given birth to Jesus, and so now she's required to go through that purification process. But there are other manuscripts, or at least other texts. There's a textual variant between printed texts. There's actually not a textual variant in Greek manuscripts, but there's a textual variant among printed Greek texts.
Yes,
some have
correct.
her,
Thank
some
you for
have
clarifying
there.
that.
I should explain that. There, in my estimation, and I haven't looked at every Greek manuscript, but I've dug through the apparatuses, I don't think there's any textual support whatsoever for her purification.
It's usually there.
Yeah, it's either there.
I think there's a his. I think there's a his.
Yep, there is.
Possibly. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few
Scrivener
minor
would put
variants.
her, wouldn't it?
I'm sorry.
Right? Scrivener would back translate her as part of Scrivener's.
That's right.
He would. He
Yeah,
would.
exactly.
Yeah,
Wow.
which of course he comes later. But what he's reconstructing is to say, what did the King James translators land on? What he didn't know about is that in this other document from the Bodleian, we can go back and watch them wrestling with this, and you can see their base text says her, and there is no marginal note. And someone comes along in the process of probably this company stage, I think, and they write a marginal note and say, hey, there's a textual variant here. We should let the reader know that there's a textual variant. So he puts a marginal note that says some copies have there, just to explain that there's a textual variant there. But we can watch a second stage of revision take place when someone comes along and says, I think we got that wrong. I disagree. Instead of her in the text and there in the margin, we should swap those. And so he rearranges it so that now there is in the text and her is in the margin. So we can see really clearly two steps of revision there taking place, maybe both at the company stage, maybe some at the company stage and some at the general meeting. We're not sure, but there's definitely two steps in the revision there. But there's also a third step in the revision there, because when you look at the published King James Bible, it has switched again.
It's now back to her.
Yeah, now the text has gone back to her. And here's the key thing. Not only does the text go back to her, there's no marginal note to let the reader know, oh, there's a textual variant here. So they've not only reversed the decision about the base text in the margin, they've decided not even to put a textual variant in the margin, which is one of the reasons I think Scrivener's list of textual variants that are recorded in the margin, sometimes people treat that like, oh, well, that's every textual decision that they made. That's not every textual decision they made. Not even remotely.
In the margin at the final cut of things.
Yeah, exactly. But at the very least, it shows us this. The King James translators sometimes disagreed with themselves. We could debate, was that second Oxford company just debating among themselves and one translator says this and another translator disagrees? Or was it the company? I think I lean this way. I think the company itself made its revisions and sent it to the general meeting in Stationers Hall, and Stationers Hall reversed those decisions. That's what I think probably happened. But whichever of those it was, you have King James translators disagreeing with King James translators, not just about how to translate the text. They disagree about the base text itself. They're disagreeing about a textual variant based on their printed Greek text.
And that's such a big deal, because if we're talking about, well, they got every word right. That's I've heard that half my life. They got every word right. It's like, well, which group got it right? Or which day did they get it right? If it's the group that revised it, was it Tuesday they got it right, or was it Friday they got it right? When was the Holy Spirit moving? I mean, like this becomes a problem, because Josh, even in the preface, they admit that they don't know full meanings of words.
I have. So this is such a cool topic we're on, because one of the biggest, I would say, oppositions to modern translations among King James onlyists is, it's the whole thing of textual criticism equals evil. That's a dirty word. Don't say that, textual criticism phrase around us. And it's like, if you get enough time to show a King James onlyist, the King James translators use textual criticism. It's a science, it's a process that we want to go through to make sure we're getting what actually happened. And I'm not even an expert on this, but I think it's important for me as a non-PhD expert to say, even I realize that textual criticism is reconstructing what we want to get closer to what was true. And Tim is pointing that out with that passage, even in Luke. But I think it's interesting that in the marginal notes of the 1611 King James, that's not printed often, you have notes of this verse is lacking in most manuscripts, or
Luke
this,
17:36 is
Yeah.
one of
yeah,
them.
right. Exactly.
It says wanting. I think it says it was wanting.
Wanting.
in
Yeah.
most
And I have here one of those like 400-year editions of the King James.
Oh, yeah.
And I love it because I go through in the marginal notes. I think it's in Luke 22. It's the one about like one is taken and one is left.
That's
and
Luke 17:36. Yep, that's the one I was mentioning. Yep,
that's it. Okay, yeah, and they say, yeah, this one is wanting or lacking in most translations and or manuscripts, and I'm just like, hello, red flag. They're literally making decisions of, do we put this verse in here or do we not? Now, listen, if you want to get into the whole big realm of Alexandrian text versus Byzantine and all that, forget that. Let's just focus on if the King James translators are even making decisions on what verses should or shouldn't go in, they're doing textual criticism there. And I think that's an important point of trying to dismantle King James onlyism.
And that's an interesting point, Timothy, because we know that they used as a standard Greek text, particularly the 1598 Beza, and then they also included the 1550 Stephanus, and they most probably didn't use much of it, but they did have Erasmus. But it seems like they did have knowledge outside of the printed Greek text of manuscripts, at least not to the level we have today, but they were interested. For them to say this is wanting in most manuscripts, even though it was included in these other printed texts, means that they had some level of understanding beyond the printed text. I mean, these are intelligent men.
Yeah.
These are very, and I want to make sure everybody that's listening this year, the King James translators were very intelligent men. Who are very educated and very qualified to do what they did.
Yeah.
So kind of talk about that. They clearly had a knowledge of the text, and that was their standard, but they did think outside of those texts quite a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think that we have a tendency to think that in the pre-modern era, and this is not just in, textual absolutism or King James onlyism or whatever you want to call it, in the broader world, we have a tendency to think of the King James Bible as a pre-modern translation that knew nothing of modern critical methods like textual criticism. I think that's just absolutely not true.
Yeah.
If you look historically, Jan Kranz wrote a marvelous dissertation on Erasmus and Beza as conjectural critics who are doing conjectural emendation. And along the way, he shows their intense text critical work in crafting printed Greek text. And they were editors, so they are examining manuscripts and creating from those manuscripts a printed text. And those texts disagree a lot. Like we mentioned earlier, Luke 2:22, that's a place where Erasmus and Beza come to a different conclusion. But none of the King James translators is an editor. None of them printed a Greek New Testament text. So they are relying on their printed text. But here's the marvelous thing about those printed texts. If you have a standard Greek New Testament that's used today, like an NA28, what you've got in any critical Greek New Testament text, you've got this marvelous apparatus that lists textual variants. So you don't have to pick up a manuscript, but by picking up a printed copy, you can see, oh, here's what manuscripts read. That's the approach that most translators use today. When they're working on the NIV, they don't pull out an actual, 1,000-year-old Greek manuscript. They rely on an apparatus, and that apparatus tells them what the manuscripts read. Same thing for the King James translators. I don't think any of the King James translators were consulting manuscripts. But they did have an interest in what the manuscripts said. And you can see that in some of their writings. Their access to that manuscripts then comes from the notes inside the printed Greek text that they are using. And we do know that they used Erasmus because John Boyce, in the notes that he takes at the general meeting, he specifically mentions Erasmus a number of times in his notes. We know that they used Beza really heavily because Scrivener's work, and then Irina Bacchus did a whole dissertation to show how closely they followed Beza sometimes. But here's the key thing about Erasmus, Beza, and Stephanus, the three primary texts that they're making use of. All three of those texts have notes that explain textual variants. Thousands of them in the aggregate. I think Erasmus himself said, I wrote over 1,000 annotations for my first edition. Not all of those are text critical annotations, but a good chunk of them are. And that's just in the first edition. It goes through 5 editions before it's done in 1535. So they are literally surrounded by hundreds, if not thousands, of notes raising text critical issues. And when they are wrestling with text critical questions, they're doing so on the basis of those notes. So they are being careful scholars by the standards of their day. And here's the key thing. They are doing textual criticism. And if they are doing textual criticism, that means that the text that they produced is not the exact verbally same text that has existed for 2,000 years. They are reconstructing what they think is the most accurate text, and it is different than every form of the text that has been published before that. And we need to hear that very carefully for those that come from a textual absolutist background that think, oh, well, I believe in preservation. The Bible's just always stayed the same. The King James translators just kind of put it into English. Nope. We can watch on as the King James translators make different textual decisions, and their exact particular combination of textual decisions that gets printed in 1611 in the King James Bible. Now, lots of texts were similar to it, but that exact combination of readings had never existed before and never existed in print until 1881 when Scrivener printed it.
Yes.
Yeah. See, and so this is, you probably remember this from Heartland days, but here's Scrivener's, Greek text here.
Good times.
Yeah. You remember this too, Stephen. So what's funny is this Greek or this Greek collection, for the part that's not Hebrew, this has never existed in the history of the world. The way that the words have lined up until Scrivener put it together. I'm saying, as far as him back translating from the King James as the source, it's not like this is some like magical, complete Greek text that has existed through the ages, word for word. But that is what you're indirectly taught to think about the text Receptus. And I like what Mark Ward has done with referencing the Textus Receptus, and he often calls it the Texti Recepti. And he's got a great lecture at Bob Jones, actually, within the last couple of years, talking about which TR is the perfect TR. And he goes through all the different additions and tweaks between this one and that one. And these are just great mental exercises to help our King James only, brothers understand, like, guys, we want you to see the inconsistencies that you're holding up. We're not creating these for you,
Yeah. And Timothy, you and I actually did a project a couple of years back now where we were going through some of the appendices of Scrivener, and we actually documented in some of that we did that he actually made some mistakes at the very end of the book of Revelation at what he recorded. Yeah. And that was one of the things that Jonathan Beasley and I ended up getting into a written debate against one of our professors.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When this was about, 3-4 years ago, that was Pandora's box was open.
Wow.
Dr. Charles Surratt.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So I know Surratt's books.
And we obviously were trained on those. And he's a great man, by the way. He loves the Lord, good heart, good balance. I got the impression in class that he didn't believe in a perfect translation. People would ask him a question like in Proverbs. I remember during homiletics one time somebody had asked him the question about he that has a friend must show himself friendly, and how the Hebrew doesn't read that way. And I remember him saying something to the effect, and I remember, we don't believe in a perfect translation. We believe in a perfect text. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, might want to tell your neighbor professors down the hallway that, because that's not the position of the gentleman down the road.
Yeah.
But either way, in this correspondence back and forth, I asked him multiple times, and he finally answered on the last response. Scrivener got it right. That was his answer for the perfect TR. And I remember using our work, Timothy. So that actually dates us. That was probably 4 years ago now.
Oh, yeah.
And I said, well, how is it that the case? Because what he has recorded is not what the translation that King James has. And he did it in mistake between Stephanus and Beza. And so what we have to do now we got to say that God not only authorized the original writers of the scripture to get it right in an inerrant and fallible writing, but that Scrivener had to make a mistake in the 1800s to bring it back. I mean, it's like from printed editions. And it's like, this is just insane. Yeah. And the King James translators would have never gone through this great level of detail to try to defend something so erroneous that, I mean, they were admitting that there were downfalls, that they have a list. Is it not in the preface, Josh, of words that they were struggling to find understanding to, like cities, animals?
Yeah, they say here, many words in the scriptures are never found but once, having neither brother nor neighbor, as the Hebrews say, so that we cannot be assisted by comparing their usage in different texts. There are many rare names of birds, beasts, and precious gems, for example, concerning which the Jews themselves are divided regarding their definitions, that it seems as if they have chosen this or that definition simply because they had to pick something.
Yeah, and so,
Yeah.
and I know our time's running slim here, but that's all right. I mean, but thinking about what they're saying there is they're admitting, hey, there's been debates about meanings for a long period of time. The Jews themselves can't decide on it, and let's not be bashful about this. The King James translators were influenced by other works. They had no problem letting the Septuagint influence them in the Old Testament, and they certainly allowed the Latin to come in quite a bit. They love Latin. I mean, they took notes in Latin.
Yeah.
I mean, my goodness, the great debate of Isaiah 14, Lucifer. I mean, Lucifer in Latin. I mean, they were definitely influenced beyond even the Greek and the Hebrew, because they recognized, man, there's no agreement on even what these things mean. Let's use another translation in the ancient text. Let's use the Latin. What did Jerome put? They had some nice things about Jerome, and they also had some disagreements with Jerome. So, I mean, when you look at them, they used Jerome's text, did they not, Timothy, and a lot of their influences?
Yeah, I think they are heavily influenced by the Latin text at a number of points, some of which they weren't aware of. I think the Byzantine text itself had been in some ways influenced by the Latin, but then specifically the printed Greek text that they were using, when you look at Erasmus's work, very heavily influenced by the Latin text. And he often has readings that he prints in Greek that are almost exclusively sourced from a Latin text, and sometimes that he translates, I think, directly into Greek from Latin. One scholar made a list of those, I think at least 50 of them just in the book of Revelation. So it influenced them already along the way in ways that they didn't know. But then specifically, I think it influenced their translation in the use of the Douay Rheims translation of the Latin Vulgate. We know for sure that they had that in their hands at the general meeting, because John Boyce records, one of the translators that's on that final committee of 12, records in his notes specific reference to what the Rheims reads. Rheims, however you say that word.
Yeah.
So we know that they have it, and we can show that it influenced their translation at a number of points where they pick its readings. And David Norton has a list in one of his books. I forget which one. I think the one he published in 2011. So yeah, they're being influenced by the Latin tradition, I think, at many points, some of which they're not even aware of. And it's definitely in some ways shaping their text.
Which goes back to the fact that when you look at the King James only position, that is a perfect translation, it really doesn't matter what the Greek and Hebrew have at the end of the day, because this is, I mean, and then they were influenced by the Septuagint as well in places in the Old Testament. So, I mean, there's places that we would just have to say they were kind of a mixed bag of goodies, and they pulled out whatever they pulled out ended up being the Holy Spirit's decision to come up with the perfect translation. It's the only inerrant, infallible word. The other stuff, they settled a lot of problems. Well, they settled it amongst the Latin, they settled amongst the Greek and the Hebrew, and then the Septuagint, the Greek and the Old Testament, and then they even reference the other works. I mean, they have no problem talking about some of the other texts in the ancient translations as well. I mean, they bring it up in their preface, for goodness sakes. Go ahead. So
it's interesting, and connecting to your Trail of Blood series, they reference Augustine. Even Augustine, they say, used certain rules that were made by Tychonius, who was a Donatist, but he found favor in his understanding of the word. So I think it's interesting that they realize throughout all of history, we've got some wacky guys, we've got some wacky texts and traditions, and yet somehow it all connects to give us what we're building upon the foundation of today. And I think it's, what I'm hearing consistently in the King James only circles I'm still connected to is this phrase here, this mantra. If you can't give me an every word Bible, then you can't give me a Bible. And it's that assertion of, I need to have an every word Bible, or I don't believe God whatsoever, and he didn't keep his promises. And what I have found, I've never gotten an answer to this yet. When I throw this back at them, I've reversed their claim, and I say, I can't be a King James onlyist because it makes God a liar up until the year 1611. What you're doing is you're saying in 1611, he made this every word Bible, but he didn't keep that promise to everybody else living before that time. Yeah. And I think it's just giving the photo negative of that argument can't be flipped on its head and hold weight. And that's what we're trying to, with these discussions here, hopefully someone hears this and starts to think critically about some of these things that don't add up.
Yeah, and the King James translators themselves were not opposed to their own work being revised after they finished putting it out. I mean, Timothy, how many editions are we up to I mean, there's a condensed of the major ones, but there are also some very minor ones that were throughout history.
If you count all the major ones, I think I went one time to Pollard and Redgrave and the big Herbert volume of list of editions of the English Bible. This was years ago. In fact, I think it was when you and I were making a video together years ago. But I remember sitting down and counting each of the ones that seemed to distinctly be a King James edition. There's well over 400 of them. If you count every little minor edition. Now, obviously, most of those don't have serious changes, made to them. There's, maybe a dozen of the bigger editions, but they are definitely consistently revised. And here's the key thing that we need to understand. And I think this is the single most important thing for someone who's a textual absolutist. That's the framework that I use in a group that we call the Textual Confidence Collective, for anyone who believes that their particular form of the Bible is above revision, whether that be I've got a perfect translation, or okay, maybe the translation is not perfect, but I've got a perfect Greek text. Whichever position. If you think you've got a text that cannot be revised and can't be corrected, here's the thing you've got to wrestle with. Hold that text in your hand and trace its history, and it is itself a revision. Yes. Whatever form of the text you're holding, whether you're holding up a Scrivener 1881 TR, or whether you're holding up a 1611 King James Bible, or a much later printing of the King James Bible, that is a revision that did not exist until that particular revision was produced. So if you sketch out a timeline, whether it's to 1611 or to 1881 or whatever it is, there's a huge chunk of the history of the church before that moment where that exact form of the Bible didn't exist. So if you want to turn around and claim this is the verbally perfect exact form of the Bible, you have to reckon with the fact that you do not believe in the preservation of Scripture. You might talk all the time about the preservation of Scripture, but you are essentially forced to conclude, I don't believe anyone had a perfect Bible until 1611, or I don't believe anyone had a perfect Greek text, exactly verbally perfect, until 1881.
Yeah.
That's not belief in preservation that motivates that. No. And the only thing that can sustain that kind of a position, I think, is to say God re-inspired the translators, or God re-inspired Erasmus, or God re-inspired Scrivener. Now, I will acknowledge most of them don't say that. They sense in their hearts, oh, that seems like a really radical claim. I don't want to claim that the King James translators were re-inspired, with new revelation. But I think if they would study the history of the text, they'd realize that is what their position requires. If you think a particular form of the Bible is perfect and cannot be revised and cannot be corrected, you are forced to believe that the editors and revisers who created it were inspired by God. There's just really not any other option. And I'll make one final plug there if I can, Stephen. I know we're going to end. You mentioned, Joshua, earlier how powerful it was for you to read the preface to the King James Bible, and you may be circling back to that. I just make a plug for this as we talk about that Greek text. We used this volume at Heartland as our textbook, which is the Trinitarian Bible Society's publication of it. They just recently re-released a new edition of that in a beautiful leather binding.
I did not know
that. Anybody? Yeah, it's excellent. And then there's another third group that still publishes it today. All three of those groups have one thing in common, or all three of these editions have one thing in common. They're writing primarily for people who defend the Textus Receptus, and they print this 1881 TR of Scrivener without his preface.
Oh, no.
Over and over again. Now, if that happened once, I might say, well, that was just a mistake. No. But when that happens 3 different times in 3 different groups printing this particular text, I can't speak to their motives. I can't see their hearts, but something's odd there. Why are they not wanting to print the preface that Scrivener wrote? So I would encourage anyone who believes that the Greek text behind the King James Bible New Testament, the 1881 Scrivener TR, is perfect. Go get a copy of that Greek text, like this one reprinted by Cambridge, who actually owns the rights to the text and still prints it today. Go get a copy of that text that still has the preface, or go to my website, kjbhistory.com, and you can find, I have a blog post where I wrote about Scrivener and just wrote out for you his entire preface so you can read it. Go read that preface, because when you read that preface, you'll come to understand that particular Greek text did not exist in print until 1881. Now, I'm not saying it's massively different from what came before. The differences are minor, but that exact collection of words in Greek had never been published before 1881. And so and Scrivener makes that extremely
clear.
Very clear. He explains where it came from and why he put it together. And I won't go into all that. You can read it yourself. But he makes it very, very clear that particular collection of words had never been published until 1881. And it was published as a companion volume to the English Revised Version that Scrivener and Westcott and Hort and others were working on. So you have to wrestle with this question. If that's the text that I'm going to hold up is as verbally perfect, nobody had a verbally perfect Bible before 1881 in Greek. They didn't have a perfect Greek text. Do I really want to argue that that's the case?
And if Scrivener were alive today, he would argue and say, "Don't argue that for me."
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
I mean, Scrivener had issues with certain readings within the TR. I mean, he was not bashful. He had issues in Matthew 16. I mean, he was
1 John 5:7. He didn't think
1
was
John
original.
5:7. Yeah, he didn't think it was original at all, along with Erasmus and others. And I mean, and this is something that people misrepresent him, Dean Bergon. I mean, these guys were for revision. I mean, that's why Bergon wrote Revision Revised. He was not against revision. He wasn't for the revision of Westcott and Hort, but they were for revision. And their texts and their goals that they get used for was not their positions. And this is why I think it's dangerous to publish these works of these individuals and not give a preface. And so, I mean, Josh, you wrote a book on it, The Forgotten Preface. So it kind of self-answers, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Should the King James translations that are being produced today have the preface of the translators to the readers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely advocate, if I could, for that, because I have found people that, my book is not the definitive work on King James onlyism and bringing people out of it. I much suggest, read D.A. Carson, read Mark Ward, read, Tim Berg's blogs. But the unique way that God has used this is it's this weird skeleton key that's a self-destructing piece of the King James only argument. When you realize, wait a second, this thing that used to be in all King James Version Bibles to help you understand what you're about to read dispels and disproves that whole viewpoint before you even read Genesis 1:1. So I completely am an advocate that should be produced in every printed King James Version Bible.
You agree with that, Timothy?
Yeah, no, I think it, just as I mentioned with the Greek text, and that was kind of my experience, was coming across, Scrivener's preface, and Josh, your experience was coming across that preface to the King James Bible. Yeah. I think all three of us were raised in a world, intentionally or accidentally, that was largely ignorant of the history of the text. And I'd encourage everyone watching to go read for yourself both of those prefaces. Read the preface to the original 1611 King James Bible, read the preface to Scrivener's 1881 TR, and you'll start to realize, and I'm not saying people were malicious about it. I think sometimes they're just misled or ignorant or just didn't know better, but they've given you a history of the text that's not true. And all you need to do is read the prefaces of the very works that you hold up so high to realize, oh, the history that I've been told of this text just isn't accurate. And that doesn't honor Jesus.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And let me take that a step further for the both of you. Do you think that there should be a production, not only of the preface, but the footnotes of the King James translators? What do you think, Josh?
Absolutely. Any major modern Bible translation has some form of footnotes, whether it's the ESV or the CSB, that are very helpful as you're reading along and seeing this can also be translated this way. Other manuscripts show this and show that. The New King James often has that as well. And it's a project I started and have not finished, but I have kind of a sequel called The Forgotten Footnotes that I just every now and then kind of chunk away on. And I think that could almost be even more helpful than the preface of showing people, look at this text that actually has a lot of asterisks next to them as you start going through it. So I would advocate for that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll chime in there to say two things. One, I wrote a couple years ago 2 blog posts. I think one of them was called The King James Translator's Defense of Marginal Notes. And then one was the 5 types of marginal notes. You can find those on my blog at KJB History, where I talk a little bit about them. It's probably not to the extent and detail you will. The second thing I would say is I really encourage this Bible. I'm sure you guys are both familiar with it, but maybe not all of your viewers would be.
It's the mine right here.
Yeah, the New Cambridge Paragraph Bible edited by David Norton. And there are a number of places today where you can get a King James Bible that has the original preface and the original notes.
Yeah.
But Norton has done just such a marvelous job printing the text in a beautiful, easy to read format that's essentially almost a reader's Bible. It's a paragraph Bible. And also reprinting that original preface in a very easy to read format that's not like hard on the eyes or hard on the, the archaic spellings. He's also reprinted all those original notes so that you get all the marginal notes. And he's got a wonderful introduction that explains the history of the text. I love this Bible so much. My wife and I got married using this Bible. I love the King James. I read from it regularly. And when I do, this is the King James I read from. I think it's the most well done text. that reconstructs the intentions of the translators. And I really do love the King James Bible, and this is the one I would recommend to people regularly. This is my regular KJV reader.
Yeah.
I looked into one of those and I saw the price. I was like, I'll just carry on.
I will say you can get a cheap paperback. There's a paperback published by Penguin Books. Yeah. I have one around here somewhere, but they publish a series of like classical works, and they published the Bible, and they published the King James Bible. When Norton did his text, they were so impressed with it. They said, that's the text we want to print as our just classic reprint. So you can go, I forget the exact title, but if you search Penguin Books, New Cambridge Paragraph Bible, David Norton, you can find one of those paperback used for like $5.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it's not calfskin. I mean, there's something.
Yeah, no, it won't be beautiful.
You want it to smell like a cow. I mean, that's what you want.
And I'll tell you one quick story before we wrap up and everything. But this was the first time I read the preface was in this New Cambridge Paragraph Bible.
Oh, really?
Yep. And it was so small. I mean, it's good, but the print was small that I ordered this kind of direct to print one from Amazon. Mm-hmm. But the funny providential way that I ended up with this is a guy that I went to Bible college with had this. He kind of had his parents' credit card and just bought whatever he wanted. So if he wanted a new Bible, he would just buy it. Well, he didn't come back one semester, and he left all of his books behind. Oh. So I went in there, and I'm like, I asked my dorm supervisor, can I take this? He's like, yeah, he's not coming back. And then all these years later, when I started scratching my head, I opened this up, and I'm like, wait a second, the preface is in here. So that guy not coming back to Bible college actually helped me end up coming to this and finding the preface. So
that's awesome. That's beautiful.
Wow. Yeah. Man, who would have thought the divine appointments that happen on a Bible college that would disagree with your book?
Yep.
It's because of them. It's because of them. And I agree with both. I agree with you 100%. I think the preface, I think the footnotes should be included. I'm thankful that people are doing the work to put those out there. Yes, they're expensive. I'm glad to hear there's a $5 paperback, because I might actually be investing in that one. I have so many King James versions in boxes as it is, with so many notes of my own in them and stuff. It's like, oh my goodness. But it's interesting, by the way, that the ACNA, the Anglican North American congregations, use the Book of Common Prayer. It's a 2019 edition, and all the scripture verses are typically in the ESV.
Oh,
it is interesting, though, in church when we do Eucharist on the screen, we do the Lord's Prayer, that it is a King James form, because it's got obviously the longer ending to it, but it's still in the King James English. They change debt, though, to on the aspect about sins. It doesn't have debtors there. Yep. So it changes that, but everything else is King James. But it's interesting. The ACNA's Book of Common Prayer 2019 edition is ESV for the Anglicans. So they don't even use the King James anymore. So that's fun fact. And I'm fine with that, by the way, because I think we need an update. So, but anyway, that was great. All right. So really good information. We went over a little bit, but I appreciate you guys hanging around for the little bit of time that you did. I'll pull you guys backstage, and then we'll finish up talking in a minute. Everybody else, thank you for tuning into this episode. We always appreciate you joining in and listening. There's some comments in there and some good feedback. Also, keep in mind, if you're listening to this, you missed it. Some of the work for Timothy is in there. His blog is in there. Then you can also find his website that he's referenced multiple times. The book that Josh was holding up that he wrote, it is available as well. So make sure that you are looking into these. Josh's book is very inexpensive. Reading a blog is free. So just get in there and check out their work. You'll be very, very impressed with what they've done. If you've enjoyed this, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel as you follow Explore Christianity, and also as you continue to follow the podcast, particularly with facts. Thanks again, always, for tuning in. If you have any questions, again, in regards to this, you can find our website link as well at explorechristianity.net and reach out. There's also more material there for you as well. As always, my audience, thanks again. Thank you.